moms and dads. We are back at it again. Another week has flown by, and I hope that you had a great time on Sunday looking at Gideon. We are going to be looking at Judges chapter 8, verses 1 to 35. And as you read through that, I want you to note God's grace despite Gideon's failing. So this week, we're going to continue our study in Gideon. Last week, we looked at Gideon the Small. This week, we're looking at Gideon the Great. And what we're going to be looking at and teaching is that God graciously keeps his promises even when we don't always love him completely and we fail to do what is right. So in the preceding two chapters, we were introduced to a timid man who needed constant reassurance that the Lord would give him victory and rescue his people. The passage we're looking at this week is going to show a very different side to Gideon's character, and it is perhaps going to hint a little bit at the effect that pride can have on a person's actions. So this is a great theme to bring up with our children, because I think it's one that they can identify with, and I think it's a great life lesson for them to learn about pride, because it's one of the things for us as Christians that can really cause us to sin and to trip us up in our relationship with the Lord. So we know from last week that the Lord had deliberately reduced the massive army of 32,000 men to just 300, and he had given Gideon a great victory. So those chapters were all filled with references to the Lord and what he did for Gideon. But in this chapter, what we're going to see is that the Lord fades into the background and Gideon takes center stage, acting alone. So open up your Bibles, if you will, to chapter 8, and we can just make a few notes on some of those verses. So verses 1 to 3, Manasseh and Ephraim, they were the central tribes in Israel. Gideon had originally called the men of his own tribe, which was Manasseh, as well as Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, but he had left Ephraim out until the battle was over. The Ephraimites were angry about not being included, and so Gideon used careful flattery because the war was not yet done. He also noted the part that had already played in the killing of Oreb and Zeb, two of the Midianite leaders. Then in verses 4 to 9, so Gideon appears to be on his own mission as he relentlessly pursued the kings of Midian despite the weariness of his own men. The selfish motive for this mission becomes clear later when it's revealed that he was seeking revenge for the deaths of his brothers. You can see that in verse 18 and 19. Succoth is where Jacob had once encamped. That's Genesis 33 verse 17, near the Jabbok River. And Peniel is the place where Jacob had wrestled with God, and he had seen God's face. That was in Genesis 32 verse 30. The irony is that Gideon is not seeking God's face here, but rather he is asserting that he would be victorious and would return to punish those who had not supported him. So in verse 10 to 12, despite Gideon's pride, the Lord was clearly behind the scenes, enabling him to win a remarkable victory against a 15,000 strong army. Then in verse 13 to 17, we see Gideon turns to punish the men of Succoth as he had promised. He destroyed the tower of Peniel, and he even put the men there to death. Then in verse 18 to 21, we are suddenly introduced to Gideon's son, Jether, to whom Gideon passed the task of exacting his vengeance, but the boy refuses. He was a timid boy, much like his father was when he first was used by God, and this highlights for us the change in Gideon's character. Then verse 22 to 35, the people now want to appoint Gideon as their king, not just as a judge, and to establish a rule that will be passed from father to son. A judge was meant to lead under God's kingship, and so Gideon rightly rejects their request. In practice, however, his attitude was very different. He received tribute from the people. He took a town of his own. He had many wives, and a concubine, and he even named his son Abimelech, which means, my father is king. It is possible that in making the golden ephod, Gideon intended the people to look to the Lord as their king, but the plan backfired horribly and it became an object of worship to all Israel, as well as to Gideon himself. An ephod was a garment that was worn by a priest, and then the two stones in the breastpiece were used when looking for guidance from the Lord. Gideon then retires from public life, and God's grace was evident in the 40 years of peace which Israel had enjoyed. But as soon as he died, we know what happens, don't we? The cycle begins again. They forgot Gideon, the Lord, and his rescue. And so, moms and dads, the life of Gideon, it clearly shows us the many facets of God's grace and his commitment to his people, despite cowardness, pride, anger, greed, and idolatry. When Gideon was timid and cowardly, the Lord reassured him. When Gideon was proud and self-seeking, the Lord nevertheless gave him victory and delivered his people. God used a man with many mixed motives and limited abilities to faithfully rescue his people and to give them the peace that he had promised. I wonder if you would take a few moments just to reflect for yourself on this passage before Sunday. Will you think about your Christian life and your ministry? How may you perhaps be similar to Gideon in your motives and your actions? And have you seen evidence of God's grace despite your failings? Then secondly, how does Jesus compare with Gideon? Where does Jesus succeed where Gideon failed? And then lastly, will you give thanks to God that Jesus is the perfect King and rescuer who rules self-sacrificially? And will you give thanks that God graciously promises to use you and to use me despite our failings? Have a wonderful time on Sunday, and I pray that you as moms and dads, that you'll be encouraged and challenged by this passage in Judges as you prepare to teach your children on Sunday.